Sarah Bas Hachaver Avram Zimmer, Esther Bas Dov Badner, the Neshamas shall have an Aliyah. We know that this week's Parsha, Parshas V'eschanan, we repeat the Aseres Hadibros. The repetition of Aseres Hadibros for the most part are in fact repetitive. However, we know that there are many very clear differences between the Dibros Rishonos and the Dibros Achronos. Most notably, perhaps, most famous, is certainly the difference between the Torah records, the way the Torah records the Dibros Rishonos, the mitzvah of Shabbos, in the Dibros Rishonos and in the Dibros Achronos. We know that the Dibros Rishonos, the Torah says, Zocher es yom Shabbos l'kadshei, which is where Chazal learn out the mitzvah of Kiddush, Zochreyu al hayayin. In the Dibros Achronos, in this week's Parsha, we have Shomer es yom Shabbos l'kadsho. Also very, very striking is not only that the difference between Zocher versus Shomer, but the reasoning that the Torah gives behind the mitzvah of Shabbos is different in Parshas Yisroel, the Dibros Rishonos, and Parshas V'eschanan, the Dibros Hachronos. Whereas in Parshas Yisroel, the Torah follows up Zocher es yom Shabbos l'kadsho by saying, why are you keeping the mitzvah of Shabbos? Because the Rebbeinu Shalom created the world in 6 days and he rested on the 7th day. So, Zeichel L'maisa Bereishis, you are going to keep Shabbos. Whereas, over here in Parshas V'eschanan, that's not how we have it. We have Shomer es yom Shabbos l'kadsho, but then the Torah continues, Shomer es yom Shabbos l'kadsho. Why? Sheish es yom tavloi v'asisa kom melechtecha v'yom hashvi Shabbos l'Hashem Elokecha v'yisasech hamalacha tevin chavitecha avdocha v'matzcha v'hemtecha v'sharcha v'chamarcha v'chol v'gerecha asher b'sharecha l'man yanuach avdocha v'matzcha kamoicha v'zacharta ki eved ha'yisa be'eretz Mitzrayim. So over here in Parshas V'eschanan we have the reason of Zeicher liyetzias Mitzrayim, whereas in Parshas Yisroel we have Zeicher l'maisa bereishis. Of course, we mentioned both of these aspects in the Kiddush on Shabbos. We mentioned both Zeicher l'maisa bereishis and Zeicher liyetzias Mitzrayim. But the question is, why in Parshas Yisroel the Dibros Rishonos is the focus on Zocher / Zeicher l'maisa bereishis, whereas in Parshas V'eschanan the focus of the Dibros Achronos is Shomer Zeicher liyetzias Mitzrayim. In fact, Rav Meir Arik suggests, very interesting, we know the Ramban writes in his drashas, the Ramban has a drasha where he writes, it's called the Drasha l'Rosh Hashanah. And in the Ramban, a very fascinating drasha from the Ramban. But one of the points which he delves into is the names of our months. We know the names of our months are not Mida Araisa. Those aren't the months that the Torah gives, doesn't give name to the months. The Torah just gives numbers from the time that we left Mitzrayim. So the Ramban explains that in fact the months are supposed to be Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, and therefore we would count month Chodesh. The first Chodesh is of course Nisan, because that's the month we left Mitzrayim. Says the Ramban, however, that switched when Klal Yisrael came back from Bavel. They wanted to remember, make a Zeicher for the fact that they got out of Golus Bavel, so they took the names from Bavel to remember that they got out of Bavel. Then we no longer had in the month a Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. Says Rav Meir Arik, that's the difference. In the Dibros Rishonos, before the Dibros Rishonos, before Egel Hazav, so there's not going to be any Golos, so therefore we have a Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim in the month, every month. The fact that it's a month, whatever month we call it, is a month in corresponding to Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. Once there's going to be a Golos, because there's an Egel Hazav and the Shviras Halucha, so now there's going to be a Golos. Now the month can no longer be depended upon to remember a Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, because the months are going to switch from being corresponding to Yetzias Mitzrayim to corresponding to when we left Bavel. So therefore in the Luchas Shniyas, therefore we need another Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. So that's why Luchas Shniyas, Shabbos becomes a Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. Fascinating suggestion by Rav Meir Arik, but it still doesn't explain the difference between Zocher and Shomer. If we are to assume that the fact that it says Zocher is also the reason why it says Zeicher l'maisa bereishis, and the fact why in V'eschanan it says Shomer is also why it says Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, so then we have to understand the connection between the two and what exactly switched between Parshas Yisroel and Parshas V'eschanan, that we switched from Zocher to Shomer, from Zeichel l'maisa bereishis to Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. And I believe the answer is found in a very, very short comment from the Svarno. The Svarno, fascinatingly enough, here in Parshas V'eschanan, throws in a very, very short line, but it's very, very integral, I believe. Says the Svarno, "Lekadshoy kasher tzivcha be'osa ofen shetzivicha be'mara." I already was mitzvah you in Mara on the mitzvah of Shabbos. Ki amnam kishetzivucha sham ala Shabbos hodia shelo yaspik lo shetikadsheu b'meshet tishbos b'melacha. It's not enough that you are just rest from melacha and you refrain from doing the 39 melacha, says the Svarno. Aval shetasok by b'toira uve mitzvah. Says the Svarno, what the Torah over here is coming to add, Shomer Yom Shabbos Lekadshoy, is coming to say that it's not enough to have a Shabbos where one refrains from Lamites Melachos, but in fact it has to be a Shabbos where you are engaged in Shetasoik Boy B'Torah Ube Mitzvahs. That means the Shabbos of pre-Parshas V'Eschanan may have been a Shabbos of refraining from Malacha. Parshas V'Eschanan, the Dibros Achronos, are coming to transform Shabbos in from a Shabbos where we just refrain from activity, and now it becomes a day of positive engaging with the Rabbi Shalom. Now what changed? What occurred that now we're going from Zocher, Zeichel, Maisa Bereishis, now that we're transferring to Shomer, Zeichel, Yetzias Mitzrayim, now it becomes a day not only of refraining from Malacha, but of a day where we spend time with the Rabbi Shalom, Shetasok Bo B'Torah Uve Mitzvah. So this could be understood based on a very important principle of Rameir Simcha, of course, the Meshech Chachma. Rameir Simcha develops the following idea. We know, the Brisker Rav explains it at great length, as we just mentioned, there are two elements to the mitzvah of Shabbos. There's Zeicher L'Maisa Bereishis, and there is Zeicher L'Yetzias Mitzrayim. Now these two aspects of Shabbos are quite different. Every Yom Tov, for instance, you have Zeicher L'Yetzias Mitzrayim. You don't have Zeicher L'Maisa Bereishis. Shabbos has a dual component. Shabbos is both Zeicher L'Maisa Bereishis. That's one aspect of Shabbos, remembering that the Rebbeinu Shalom created the world, but there's another aspect which is Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, which almost makes it like a Yom Tiv. That's why in Parshas Emor, the very first thing in the Parshas Hamayadim, of course, is Shabbos, because Shabbos has both elements to it. It has the aspect of Shabbos, Zeichel Maisa Bereishis, but it also has an aspect of Yom Tiv, Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. A question why it needs both. The Ramban says Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim enhances the Zeichel Maisa Bereishis. Not only did the Rebbeinu Shalom create the world, but he's constantly involved in the world, as we see played out during Yetzias Mitzrayim, but we have both elements. We have Zeicher L'Maisa Bereishis, and we have Zeicher L'Yetzias Mitzrayim. The Melacha, the Isser Melacha of Zeicher L'Maisa Bereishis and Zeicher L'Yetzias Mitzrayim is also different. The Isser Melacha appears to be the same, but it's very, very different. We know one difference of Ochel Nefesh, but inherently it's different. Why? From a concept that we referred to in the Gemara of Chiluk Melachas. When it comes to the Isser Melacha on Shabbos, every Melacha is considered to be its own independent, distinct Isser. The Isser of Charisha is not like the Isser of Koitzer. The Isser of Koitzer is not like Zareya. The Isser of Zareya is not like Boina. Every Melacha is its own Melacha, its own Isser. Why? Because every Melacha, from a certain perspective, is a mashal of what the Rebbeinu Shalom did to create the world. And therefore, we have to refrain from that. Zeicher L'Maisa Bereishis. What do we know what the Rebbeinu Shalom was engaged in when created the world? Our mashal for the creation of the world is the Binyan HaMishkan. We refrain from every aspect of the building of the Mishkan because that every aspect was a mashal for what the Rebbeinu Shalom did in Maisa Bereishis, and we refrain from that. So there's an Isser of Charisha, there's an Isser of Zriya. Every single one of the Malachas is an independent Isser, because if you engage in it, you're being mechalel the Shabbos that the Rebbeinu Shalom rested, and you are not doing the human equivalent of that rest. When it comes to Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, there's no aspect of Melachas, there's no aspect of the Rebbeinu Shalom rested. Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Isser Melacha, is merely so that you rest, that you refrain from work. It's not about refraining from Charisha, refraining from Zriya, and refraining from Boina. It's more that we need you to have time. Time for what? Time to spend time with the Rebbeinu Shalom, engage in Maisim Tovim, engage in Torah, engage in Tefillah. From the perspective of Yom Tov, the Isser Melacha is not about that every Melacha is Asa. There's no Chiluk Melachas when it comes to Yom Tov. When it comes to Yom Tov, there's one Isser. There's no 39 Isurim, there's one Isser. It's called don't do Melacha. If I do Charisha and Binyan and Zariya, it's all one Isser, because the nature of the Isser Melacha by Yom Tov is rest. don't be active. When it comes to Shabbos, it's not about resting. It's about don't do charisha, don't do binyan, don't do zareya, because each one of those is something that the Rebbeinu Shalom engaged in, kaviyachol, during Maaseh Bereshis. So we have both elements, two different types of melachas, two different types of Isser melacha. Both are true when it comes to the Isser melacha of Shabbos. There's an Isser Malacha of Zeichel Maaseh Bereshis. There's an Isser Malacha of Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. For instance, if the Torah sometimes says, Kol ha'oiseh bo malacha, you must. If you do malacha, you will die. Sometimes the Torah says, Mechalaleha, most you must. Why? Because you could do malacha, but you could also be Mechalal Shabbos. Two different Isurim Malacha. The Isser Malacha of Zeichel Maaseh Bereshis, the Isser Malacha of Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, and therefore two different Oinshin. Kol ha'oiseh bo malacha, you must, and Mechalal Mos, you must. So we have both of these aspects when it comes to the Isser Melacha of Shabbos. The aspect of Shabbos, Zeichel Maaseh Bereshis, the aspect of Yom Tif, which also exists on Shabbos, of Zeicher Li'etzias Mitzrayim. Now the aspect of Shabbos is not about, as I mentioned, having time to be engaged in religiosity, to having time to be engaged in Torah and mitzvahs. The aspect of Shabbos is merely to stop working any work which resembles the work that the Rebbeinu Shalom did. That is Zocher Es Yoim HaShabbos L'Kadsho. You get up, you make Kiddush, you say, I am stopping to do work because the Rebbeinu Shalom stopped to do work on Shabbos. That Zeicher L'Maaseh Bereshis. What is the lashon of Shamor? Shamor Es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho. Shamor refers to negative. Don't do. But what do you mean? The Torah says, Lo yisasach malacha. That Torah asks me in doing any malacha. Shamor is a positive commandment to refrain from work. A positive commandment to refrain from work. How do I have a positive commandment to refrain from work? Comes the Meshech Chochmah and explains as follows. If I only had the Isurim De'araisa of Shabbos, could I still be engaged in my business? Yeah, most of us could engage in our business on a regular Tuesday and a Thursday, and we wouldn't violate an Isser Melacha on Shabbos. If a person wants to, he could have his whole business set up with a Mira L'Nachri. A person could do Daber Dover. If a person didn't have the aspect of Dirabbanans on Shabbos, so you wouldn't have the element of Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. You would still have the element of Zeichel Maaseh Bereshis, because I'm refraining from these 39 Melachas. Rebbeinu Shalom refrained from these 39 Melachas Kaviyachol. I'm refraining from these 39 Melachas Kaviyachol. I'm refraining from these 39 Melachas. I would have Zeichel Maaseh Bereshis. But if all I had was the mitzvah, the Yisurim, the Lamates Melachas Mida Araisa, would I have a rest? Would I have time to spend with the Rebbeinu Shalom? Would I have a day of Shabbos to be oisek in Torah mitzvahs like the Sforno says? No. So says the Ramban, that's why the Torah has to write, Shomer es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho, come and tell Chazal that it's not enough to refrain from the Lamates Melachos, but you have to come and make dinim derabbanan. It means that the Shomer is coming here saying, make a safeguard to my Shabbos. Make dinim derabbanan that protect my Shabbos, because if you don't have dinim derabbanan that protect my Shabbos, so then you won't be able to have the Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. The Zeichel Maaseh Bereshis you'll refrain from 39 Melachas. But the Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim is not just about refraining from work. Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim is about remembering that the Rebbeinu Shalom chose us, He took us out of Mitzrayim, and therefore I'm going to spend time with the Rebbeinu Shalom, I'm going to learn, I'm going to spend time on my spiritual life. That's Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. And if I don't have dinim derabbanan, says the Meshech Chochmah, so then the Torah can ask for 39 melachos from today till tomorrow, but I still have my business open, I'll still have a mir l'nachri, I won't be sitting at home learning, I won't be sitting in shul davening. So the Torah comes and says, Shomer es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho. Why? We need to make a shmira, we need to make Isurim D'Rabbanan. Why? For what aspect of Shabbos? For the Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim aspect of Shabbos. So that you are engaged, not only that you refrain from 39 melachos, but that you are engaged in Avodas Hashem. So what happens? Says the Meshech Chochmah in Parshas Yisroel, the Torah comes and says there's a mitzvah of Shabbos. Zocher es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho, right? Zeichel Maaseh Bereshis, and you refrain from 39 melachos. Was there a need to have Shabbos in the Midbar? Was there a need to have a Shabbos in the Midbar where I refrain from work so that I could engage in my Avodas Hashem, so I don't have to be Oisik in Parnasa? In the Midbar, there was no need for that. They were Ma'oichle Hamon. So therefore, the only Shabbos that they needed in the Midbar, says the Meshech Chochmah, was Zocher Yom Shabbos Lakacho, refrain from 39 malachas, and that's all you have. And Zeichel Ma'aseh Bereishis, Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. That's all about having a day to spend the Rebbeinu Shalom. They had 7 days a week to spend the Rebbeinu Shalom. Their Shabbos was no different than their Tuesday in terms of their Ruchnias. The only added aspect was Zeichel Ma'aseh Bereishis. But now they're going into Eretz Yisroel, and now Moshe Rabbeinu is saying Shabbos is not going to be good enough. Because now, if all you have is Zeichel Ma'aseh Bereishis, you refrain from 39 malachas, so what's Shabbos going to look like? Shabbos is going to look like a regular day. Just instead of you doing the plowing, you're going to have your guy do the plowing. You're going to be overseeing. What day is there going to be to remember that the Rebbeinu Shalom took you out of Mitzrayim, and remember what the Rebbeinu Shalom wants from you, and to be engaged in learning and davening? What day you're going to have? That's only Shabbos. So we have to transform Shabbos from a day which is just Zeichel Ma'aseh Bereishis, where you're just refraining from 39 malachas. Now we have to transform it into a day which is Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. Why, says the Svarno? Because now that you're going into Eretz Yisrael, you're going to be engaged in your own parnas. You're not me'oichle amon. Now we need Shabbos to be aval shetasek bo b'Torah u'b'mitzvahs. So Parshas Yisroel, which was talking to the Dor Hamidbar, they had a Shabbos which is Zeichel Ma'aseh Bereishis, Zocher Yom Shabbos. Get up and make Kiddush. Remember that Shabbos, the Rebbeinu Shalom created the world, and remember the 39 malachas you can't do, to remember the Rebbeinu Shalom rested. But then comes the door who's going into Eretz Yisrael. There's a whole new aspect of Shabbos, because now Shabbos is not only about Zeichel Ma'aseh Bereishis. Now Shabbos is also Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. Remember that today, the day is not only we're going to refrain from 39 malachas, but today is the day where you're going to sit home and you're going to spend the day engaged with the Rebbeinu Shalom through Torah, through mitzvahs, through tefillah, and therefore we say Shamor. It's not good enough to refrain from 39 malachas. We need the Yisurim D'Rabbanan to totally shut down. I'm not allowed to think about malacha. I'm not allowed to talk about malacha. I'm not allowed to have a non-Jew do malacha for me. It has to be totally shut down. Why? Because it's Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim as well, as the Svarno says, Kshetasek b'boy b'Torah u'b'mitzvahs.